Hi there. I'm going to show you how to make some really delicious scalloped potatoes using a very small cast iron skillet. But first, a little bit about me. My name is Cheryl. I live in Texas with my husband and my retired Appaloosa horses and our 2 rescue dogs and some cats. And I'm also a professional potter and ceramicist. I'm a photographer, but I've also cooked competitively and won blue ribbons for my buttermilk pie and for some of my pickles and my canned goods. So first off, let me just tell you a little bit about this pan that I'm going to be using. I'm not going to mention any brand names, but I will give you dimensions. So this is cast iron. It's made in the US. It's an 8-inch casserole pan, okay? And this works perfectly for the recipe I'm going to give you, which if you're just eating the scalloped potatoes alone will serve 2 very well. And if you're using it as a side dish, it can serve 4. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the potato we're going to use. I like using a very large baking potato, and I cut it in half. And then I'm going to use what's called a Madeleine or a slicer. I picked this one up online. It's got a very sharp blade, but it can be adjusted to different heights. And you can use it on top of a cutting board, or you can use it on a bowl or anything like that. So I'm going to use it on top of a cutting board just to catch the potatoes. It also comes with a little handle that you can plunge into the potato once it starts getting smaller, because it will cut your fingers if you get too close to the edge of the potato. The other thing that you can add to this to give it a little more savory flavor are diced onions. And I usually use a white onion for that. You can use yellow, you can use red if you prefer, or you can totally leave out the onion. The nice thing about this recipe is it doesn't use a thickener for the sauce. So it's gluten-free. For anybody who's concerned about gluten, you don't have to use flour to thicken it. I work with heavy cream, and that thickens perfectly by itself. So the first thing we're going to do is prepare the cast iron pan. If you are not using cast iron, whatever your choice is, if you're using a glass oven-proof dish or a baking dish or something like that, just put a little bit of butter on it so that things don't stick. In the case of cast iron, most of the new cast iron is what's called pre-seasoned, so it's already been oiled and it's ready to cook with. I never wash my cast iron with soap. Some people do, but I don't. I just wipe it out really well after each use, and then if something's kind of stuck to it, I have a little scraper that I use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some regular unsalted butter. I use unsalted butter simply because I don't have to worry about changing the amount of salt in the recipe. And I'm just going to rub it around on the pan on the sides and on the bottom, just to give it a nice good coat of butter. And I take it over the rim just a little bit so it doesn't stick. Okay, now the catch with cast iron is it does make your butter look a little bit funky. So what I do is I cut off the part that was rubbing against the cast iron. Because it will make the butter a little bit gray looking. And I just put that in the bottom of the pan, and it will bake into the scalloped potatoes. And the rest of the butter can go back in the fridge eventually for later use. So I'm going to cut up the chunk of butter that was in contact with the cast iron just into little pieces so that there's not just one big blob of butter in one spot. Okay, now that the pan is prepped, I'm going to preheat the oven to 350. Okay, now that the oven is preheating to 350, and you want it at 350, so in my case, I have a wonderful range that has a small oven on top and a very big oven on the bottom. I do most of my baking in the small oven, so it preheats very quickly. If you're using a much larger oven, let it preheat, 20 minutes ahead of time, so when you do put the cast iron in the oven, it is actually at temperature. So now the next step is I'm going to take my potato, which I cut in half because it's just easier to hold, and I'm going to take some chopped onions, and I'm going to go ahead and start making layers. So I'm going to take my Madeleine slicer, and I'm just going to draw the potato on it, and I'm just going to keep going back each time, and you can see I'm getting these wonderful thin slices of potato. And the thing about these Madeleine slicers, you can adjust how thick the slice is. In this case, thin slices like this make wonderful scalloped potatoes, and they also make great potato chips if you decide you want to make your homemade potato chips. So I just go ahead and I start layering. And you don't have to get fussy with your layers. I'm doing this pretty for the video, but I mean you can just kind of put them in there and then sprinkle onions on there and just keep dropping them in there. The thinner the slices, the more flavorful your scalloped potatoes will be, because they're going to tend to soak up the spices and the milk and the onion flavor if you want to use onions. So I'm just sprinkling a few onions on there, and I'll start the next layer. In every other layer, I'm going to add some garlic salt and some pepper. And I like to use grinders so that you get fresh salt and fresh pepper. But if you don't have a grinder, that's fine. Just standard salt and pepper is perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and take the pepper and grind it on there. And I put about 4 to 5 turns on there. And now this is sea salt and garlic. And I'm going to add about 6 turns of that. Then I'll sprinkle a little more onion on there. And the oven has preheated. And then back to the slicing of the potato. Now, if you don't have a baking potato, you can use red potatoes, russet potatoes, whatever you have handy. It'll just taste a little bit different. Baking potatoes tend to be a bit sturdier and less mealy. But pretty much any kind of potato will do. And if all you've got is a knife and your slices are thicker, that's fine too. Now you can see I'm getting down to kind of the nub of this particular potato. So from here on out, I'm going to go ahead and mount it on the little holder here. And then I'll start slicing it again. This way it protects your fingers. And you reach a point where even with the handle, it doesn't hold real well. So you know, in this day and age, where people are very careful about how much food they discard and such, what you can do is just take that end of the potato and, you know, not worry about the fact that you can't get round slices, and just go ahead and slice it on edge. And then you can just drop those into the pan. Just remembering that your finger is holding the potato and this sucker is sharp. So I'll be doing the same thing with the second half of the onion and the second half of the potato, and then we'll come back to the next step. So now I have 4 or 5 layers of potato, onion, salt, pepper, and the garlic salt. So now what I'm going to do, and this is the entire potato that I started with, so that one large baking potato fills the pan. Next step is I'm going to pour 1½ cups of heavy cream onto the potatoes. You want to use heavy cream in this recipe, otherwise it won't thicken up. So if you use milk, you're going to have to add a thickener such as flour. So I'm trying to make this very rich and creamy, and also non-gluten, so that anybody that has a gluten issue can make this recipe with no problem. So I'm pouring the 1½ cups of heavy cream onto the potatoes. It will not cover the potatoes totally. This will not make a lot of sauce, so if you really like saucy potatoes, you're going to want to add a little more cream. But this will give you a nice creamy sauce with your potatoes, and it won't tend to bubble over. Normally with a cast iron skillet or pan, you put it in an oven on the shelf and you don't sit it on anything. I go ahead and put soupy based things like scalloped potatoes onto a cookie sheet with some aluminum foil, so that I don't have to worry about it boiling over. So I'm going to put it on the cookie sheet, and then I'm going to put it in the oven for about 60 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll do the next step, which is putting grated cheese on top. So the scalloped potatoes have been in the 350-degree oven for an hour, and you can tell they're nicely browned, and you could serve them like this if you wanted to. We like to put cheese on our scalloped potatoes, so I have a cup of finely grated Mexican cheese. You can use whatever cheese you would like. You can get fancy and use a cheese like Gruyere, or you can use Italian cheeses like you would on a pizza, mozzarella, provolone, things like that. This is Mexican cheese, and it's got some cheddar in it. So I'm going to sprinkle this on top. And depending on how much cheese you like, you can put a lot of cheese on there, or you can just put enough to cover it. And I'm just spreading it out. Then the next step will be, I will put the oven on the broiler setting, and I'll put the potatoes back into the oven under the broiler until the cheese is melted and it's browned on top, which, depending on your broiler, can take 5 minutes or less. So we'll check them in a little bit. And I've just pulled it out of the oven. I usually let them rest for about 30 minutes. That cools it down just enough so it's a very good serving temperature, and it allows the flavors of the cream and the garlic, salt, and the onions to kind of mingle, and it allows the sauce to thicken up just a touch. If you want to do something a little fancier, you can add ham to this, or you can just serve it as is, as a full meal. Thank you for watching.